Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this rather warm evening for our 2025 summer lecture, which is hosted in collaboration with the German Historical Institute, London. My name is Joe Cronin. I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute, London, and I'm delighted that this evening we are hearing a lecture by Dr. Lisa Pine. Dr. Pine is an associate fellow of the Institute for Historical Research at the University of London and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. She is a distinguished author and historian whose work focuses on the history of Nazi Germany, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. Over the course of more than 2 decades, she has published widely on these subjects and has taught at universities across the UK. She is the author or editor of 7 books. I think it might be more than 7 now. 9, there you go, using all material, including the edited volume Dictatorship and Daily Life in 20th Century Europe, published in 2022, and Soviet and Nazi Posters, Propaganda and Policies, edited with Kees Boterbloem and published this year, earlier this year, 2025. Beyond the academy, Dr. Pine is a familiar presence in the public sphere and has contributed to a number of television documentaries, including Hitler and the Nazis, Evil on Trial, which I think is Netflix, as well as Adolf Hitler, Decoding the Dictator, and The Rise of the Dictators. So, without further ado, we are delighted to welcome her here this evening to hear about the rather dubious 100th anniversary of the infamous book, Mein Kampf. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr.
First of all, thank you very much, Joe, for the very kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for being here and for those joining online this evening. I'm greatly honoured to be invited to deliver the summer lecture for the Leo Baeck Institute and its partner institutions, the GHI London, who've lent us a couple of copies of their books for this evening, and the BMI in Germany. It's also a pleasure to be here at Senate House. I'm based, as Joe said, at the IHR in the other wing of the building, so I feel at home here, which is always an added bonus. Discussing the proposed topic with Joe, not only to fit the broader lecture series theme of belonging and exclusion, but also to take the opportunity presented by the centennial of the publication of Mein Kampf, first published in July 1925. We decided on the title you can see there, Hitler's Mein Kampf, Reflections 100 Years On. Mein Kampf, of course, reflects the starkest ideology of inclusion and exclusion. But incidentally, 2025, on another note, is also the 100th anniversary of the year of the publication of The Great Gatsby, F. Scott Fitzgerald's great American novel. Whilst it would have been much more fun to talk tonight about Jay Gatsby and Nick Carraway and Daisy and Tom Buchanan, mint juleps and the American dream, that is not what we are here to do tonight. This is, okay, here goes. Hitler and the history of the Nazis remain extremely popular topics, ones that never cease to attract people's interest, even fascination. It's crucial to comprehend the nature of Mein Kampf, the author of its mindset, Adolf Hitler, and the ideology he espoused that brought untold tragedy to millions of people: death, destruction, genocide, and war. The book presents a dangerous set of ideas, regrettably ones that still have followers today, 100 years after Mein Kampf was originally penned. My colleague who I've just seen in the audience, Neil Gregor, who I've known since our PhD days, in his writing has explained carefully the tension between the scholarly imperative to show how the text works and the political necessity of preventing it from speaking. This lecture places the work in its historical context, focuses on some of the key themes of the text, as well as considering a little its journey after 1945, and reflecting a little too on why a discussion of it is still relevant today. But I'm going to start with a short section on the writing of Mein Kampf, just to situate us before addressing these topics. So, having been arrested on the 11th of November 1923, after the failure of the Beerhof Putsch and attempted seizure of power, Hitler was imprisoned at Landsberg Castle. He was fortunate indeed. Having been convicted of high treason, he received a remarkably lenient sentence and also relatively comfortable accommodation, which I can show you just an image there that gives us an idea of what that cell was like. So kind of located on an upper floor, offering a commanding view of the River Lech below, these large windows, and you know, in addition to his bed and his desk, he had shelves filled with a selection of books and reading materials and a typewriter. And in this large, comfortably furnished cell, which he adorned with the symbols of Nazism, including swastikas, obviously, he wrote an account of his life and his worldview in 1924. Right, the book, the manuscript that he published was, the manuscript that he produced was published as Mein Kampf in 1925. Hitler here gave a narrative of a version of his life or his struggle. He also firmly stated his belief on a variety of topics, including nationalism, anti-Semitism, race, eugenics, population policy, the family, propaganda, war, among others. The work, of course, formed the core of Nazi ideology and indeed of state policy once the Nazis held power in Germany between 1933 and 1945. So this, what he wrote in his time at Landsberg was published as the first volume of Mein Kampf in July 1925, as we've said, by the Nazi Party's publishing house, Franz Ayer Verlag. The second volume on Nazism's political program and the concept of Lebensraum, or living space, was written in subsequent months and published in December 1926. It's important to note that Mein Kampf only gained notoriety as a result of Hitler's political rise. Without that, and the dreadful impact that Hitler made not only on German history, but also on world history, the work would in all likelihood be little known indeed. But as a result of Hitler's power and actions, Mein Kampf is an important historical document, even though it is one that is flawed and extremely difficult to read. In terms of its purpose, it's salient to understand that Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in order to appeal to his followers and to suit their zeal and their ardency. Whilst Hitler managed to hoodwink most of the outside world during most of the 1920s and much of the 1930s too, with regard to the true nature of his ideological goals, and to sort of put them off the scent of his purpose, as written down plainly in Mein Kampf, to his followers, the work was regarded as the sacred scripture of the Nazi movement. And Hitler exploits this work, as Ottmar Plökinger contends, not only to champion his ideology, but also to present himself as a genius who created National Socialism single-handedly. So it was crucial for Hitler to stamp his authority and leadership on the movement. And this is one of the reasons why Mein Kampf presents as it does, this kind of combined sort of hybrid thing, an autobiography, a party history, a political pamphlet and a manifesto all kind of rolled into one. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about the historical context. I talked a little bit about the writing. We've got to think about the context when we are considering this, thinking in terms of the history of the Nazi Party, in terms of Hitler's experiences, as well as, of course, the nature of political life in Central Europe at the time he developed his ideas. Mein Kampf provides an insight into Hitler and his vision of history. And it needs to be understood in the context of Hitler's experiences and of the views that he developed, particularly between 1919 and 1924. It is reflective of his love of violence, aggression, and war. We'll talk more about that shortly. Hitler was not German, but Austrian, as we know, and very much influenced by events in the Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, although he despised its cosmopolitanism. We need to understand Hitler as a product of the development of European political life and ideas at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Again, I'll cite my friend and colleague in the room, Neil Gregor, saying that he rightly notes Mein Kampf was anchored in so many strands of the very mainstream 19th and 20th century thought. And again, importantly, that the language was not just Hitler's. Blokinger too explains clearly how Mein Kampf was situated within the radical right political and literary scene of the period. The style of Hitler's writing is heavily influenced by that of the Austrian press and the pamphlets that he was reading, that he had been reading during his time in Vienna. And Hitler tried to show that he was cultured and well-versed in contemporary political writings and well-read. But rather than bringing together what he'd read into anything coherent, it seems that what he tended to do, or what he did do here, was to really utilize particular phrases or slogans or ideas that he found particularly appealing and kept repeating them. I'll talk about what the book's like to read just in a moment. To be sure, Mein Kampf displays a highly subjective outlook. In it, Hitler creates a world in which he is the key character, and the work's entitled and portrayed as his struggle, after all. Mein Kampf, my struggle. So from the very earliest pages onwards, Hitler identifies a range of enemies, including the Social Democrats and the Jews. He doesn't treat the subject matter in any rational or coherent fashion at all, and indeed gives no concrete evidence at all for his assertions and allegations. Also, in terms of its structure, the work offers no coherence. It comprises angry tirades, typical of the way in which he used his oratorical skills to great effect in his speeches, and more so as the years went on in his rise to power. But this style certainly does not have the same impact written on the page. And Mein Kampf is a lengthy work, more than 600 pages. And as I suggested, and I'm going to probably say it again and then I'll get repetitive, but it is repetitive and dull. Not only is it poorly written stylistically and structurally, but also as a depiction of Hitler's life, it's unreliable in places. The author often uses really long sentences in which the meaning is lost, and it's difficult to read as a piece of writing, not only because of its turgid style and incoherent structure that I've already mentioned, but of course also because of the subject matter. And so it kind of comprises this combination of this bold and graphic language and all those slogans that I've started to mention, with large tracts of dull text. And that graphic language is pernicious and abhorrent, reflecting Hitler's rancor, rage, and resentment. It literally flies off the page. And as I said too, characterized by a kind of random collection of ideas, conflation, and repetitiveness. In short, as I said, it is not at all easy to read. Keeping in mind that Mein Kampf was written in 1924, nearly a decade before the Nazis came to power, I wanted to just spend a moment thinking about this first sentence. So it's up there for you. Today, it seems to me providential that fate should have chosen Braunau am Inn as my birthplace. And he goes on to say this small town lies on the border or the boundary between Germany and Austria. And he says, we of the younger generation at least have made it our life's work to reunite by every means at our disposal. So first thing, his very first point is about nationalism, which we're going to talk about more. So his desire to reunite, as he says, the two German states. Again, without anything like rational justification in there, no economic argument in there, but just a demand that German Austria has to return, this kind of absolute necessity to return, based on the suggestion, he says, that one blood demands one Reich or one empire. So the argument there that every last German should belong to the German nation and live within a single German state. Here we see the influence of earlier proponents of pan-Germanism, and certainly too, the corollary of the debate about a small Germany that excluded Austria or a big Germany that included Austria that had accompanied political discourse about German unification at the end of the 19th century, which had culminated in the creation of a new German empire under Kaiser Wilhelm I after the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71. So at that point, the southern German states joined the confederation of northern German states, led by Prussia, to form a united Germany, but one which excluded Austria. And from a pan-German point of view, this was a mistaken outcome, with this argument that many German speakers, especially, but not only Austrians, were outside the new German state. And the other thing I wanted to say about this first sentence relates to Hitler and his view of himself as providential. His averment that his own particular birthplace on the border was so significant. The reunification of these states, he says, through every means at his disposal, came about 14 years later, the Anschluss of March 1938. But Hitler, describing his birth on the border there as the symbol of a great mission, very much formed a central and defining aspect of his nationalism. Okay, so the next sort of section of the talk this evening, I wanted just to talk about a few key themes. There's not time to talk exhaustively about everything that's in there. I've picked some that I think are most interesting or important, and they're listed there. So I'm going to carry on a little bit with the theme of nationalism that I've just started, then on to anti-Semitism, anti-communism, war and foreign policy, and finally propaganda and education before I come on to the story after 1945. So let's have a look then at some of these aspects of ideology. So we've seen that Hitler's desire to unite the German-speaking peoples into one territory is very clear from the start. As I said, he hated the multinationality of the Austrian Empire and already seeks the creation of a common fatherland and emphasizes the need to fight for German nationalism already here. he actually became convinced that Germanism could, this is, when I say he argued that, or he became convinced that way, sometimes using his words here. So Germanism, he argued, could be safeguarded only by the destruction of the Austrian Empire. And he regarded the Habsburg dynasty as the misfortune of the German nation. And again, he kind of goes on to say that this brought about his ardent love and the kind of deep hate, so it's the kind of love of Germany at the same time as this deep hatred for the Austrian state and everything that it represented. And as I said, he's very clear in this hatefulness of the Austrian Empire, describing Vienna at the start of the 20th century as one of the most backward cities in Europe in social terms. And I think the thing that he obviously really despised and disdained was what he called a conglomeration of people. So just this idea of a mixture. And he repeatedly criticized what he called the Slavicization of Austria. And so he talked about this mixture of Czechs and Poles, Hungarians, Ruthenians, Serbs, Croats, and everywhere he said Jews and more Jews. We'll come on to those, the Jews, a little bit later. But the Austrian capital then seemed to embody to him racial desecration and kind of everything bad in this city. And he's sort of telling his narrative here, saying that the longer he lived in Vienna, the more his hatred grew for that conglomeration of peoples that I've just described, but also for this city then that seemed, an empire that seemed to corrode German culture rather than uphold it. And in essence, he maintained that only the downfall of the Habsburg Empire would engender this kind of rebirth and redemption of the German nation. Again, so that the whole thing is geared to that very first sentence that we already talked about, this union of his beloved homeland, Austria, with the fatherland, the German Reich. Okay, on to anti-Semitism, the one that is we can't ignore, because obviously this is at the heart of it, and the anti-Semitism and racial ideology are amply set out in this text. Pernicious language, so there's your trigger warning, pernicious language. And the racial anti-Semitism, he said, stemmed from his time in Vienna, as he's sort of telling his narrative, when he says his eyes were opened up to what he called the Jewish question. And he writes that this was transformative for him. And the so-called Jewish question then came to influence his entire way of thinking, and of course his policy making too, between 1933 and 1945. He writes that wherever I went, I began to see Jews, and the more I saw, the more sharply they became distinguished in my eyes from the rest of humanity. He asked, was there any form of filth or profligacy, particularly in cultural life, without at least one Jew involved in it? And concludes that the Jew was no German. So here we kind of come back to this theme about inclusion and exclusion. The last point is fundamental to our understanding of Hitler's ideology as it developed from this time onwards, and was an unchanging element within it. The Jew as an outsider, the Jew excluded, the Jew alien, not to be a member of the national community or the nation, outside the folk. And right here in 1924, Hitler states during his time that he spent in Vienna, he says he ceased to be what he calls a weak-kneed cosmopolitan and became an anti-Semite. So he says it here. This clearly presents both his sharp criticism of the ethos of the Austrian Empire that I've already described, and his open admission, as I said here, in 1924 on paper, published, of his anti-Semitism. Okay. Hitler's racial brand of anti-Semitism developed from racial theories that had become current in Europe from the second half of the 19th century onwards and kind of into the turn of the century. I won't go into too much detail, but just to kind of mention a few of the influences, the essay on the inequality of the human races, written by the French aristocrat Count Joseph Arthur Gobineau, published in 1853, and then German writers like Wilhelm Marr, Theodor Fritsch, the Bayreuth circle, so the circle surrounding the Wagners, where these ideas also gained currency. The son-in-law of Cosima Wagner, the widow of the German composer Richard Wagner, Houston Stewart Chamberlain also kind of wrote this very racist interpretation of history, and this was also influential. As was the mayor of Vienna, Karl Lueger, who scapegoated the Jews, making anti-Semitism socially acceptable there. So all of these figures and their ideas came to influence Hitler's worldview. Okay. So I'll just finish with the quote there at the end of this slide. So, you know, obviously, as we've said, multitudinous slurs, allegations, very strong language, and oft repeated. I think perhaps the strongest and most graphic statement is this one. The personification of the devil as the symbol of all evil assumes the living shape of the Jew. I'm just going to just pause there for a second so you can just take that in for a second. But as I said, that's a very graphic one, but just one of many. So I just wanted very quickly to go through some of the key allegations that, as I said, are already made here in 1924. The Jews as liars and tricksters was something that was repeated many times. So the Jew is the great master in lying, he says. Lies and deceptions are the Jews' weapons, he says. And this kind of repeated accusation, I perhaps should have maybe even noted of these things, how many times each of them are, but many, many multiples of times. So liars and tricksters is one of them. And then parasitism, so the Jews as parasites. So again, very strong language and imagery. The Jew is a bloodsucker, the Jew as a parasite in the body of other people that sort of won't be satisfied ever. And then the Jews as the seducers of Aryan girls and women. So again, kind of one of the kind of very strong graphic language. He says, with satanic joy in his face, the black-haired Jewish youth lurks in wait for the unsuspecting girl whom he defiles with his blood, thus stealing her from her people. And this is, again, a kind of argument about racial defilement, kind of the Jew systematically trying to lower the racial level through this, through racial miscegenation, this kind of racial mixing. And that becomes a very key aspect of Nazi policies. And then other ones. So this, again, kind of, this is something as well, kind of current from earlier in the century, the idea of the international world Jew and this kind of great world conspiracy. The Jew definitely has, in his view, destructive purposes, that no persecution would ever deter the Jew, he said. He wrote that after every persecution, he is back again in a short time and just the same as before. And the inference here then is for destruction, I think, because it's sort of just suggesting that the Jew keeps rising and sort of creating all of these bad things. And the next one, of course, is destroyers of culture. So he argued that the Jews had no culture, not only that they destroyed and dissolved everyone else's cultures, again, kind of partly through this intermingling and sort of contamination in his words, of art, literature, the theatre, and so on. So there's this kind of, and then lastly, this trope of, again, this absolutely makes no sense. We've got the tropes of the Jew in high finance on the one hand, and at the same time, simultaneously, the Jew equated with communism. So again, kind of when you step back and think about it, it doesn't add up. But of course, this kind of international Jewish world finance and all of that planning to destroy Germany and usurious rates of interest, I mean, all of those kinds of things follow a tradition of centuries-old anti-Semitism. And again, kind of talks about things like the complete monopoly of the Jews in finance and commerce, and they're taking over the stock exchange and this and that, and you get the idea. So that's kind of on the one hand. And then at the same time, as I said, he argues there that the Jew wields the weapon of the organized mass of Marxism. And as I said, when you put the two together, they just seemed nonsensical to me. Okay. Which brings me on to his anti-Marxism or anti-communism. And Hitler believed that the question of the future of the German nation was actually the question of destroying Marxism, as I kind of put this quote there, because he believed, in the same way as the Jews were destructive, he believed that the communists or the Marxists were destructive. And his attack on social democracy or German socialism was virulent from the start. And in fact, he said he took his position not only on social democracy, but also on trade unions from his time spent in Vienna. And he said he regarded trade unions as inseparable from the Social Democratic Party, and therefore he flatly rejected them. And again, once in power, the Nazi regime destroyed the German trade unions and banned them very, very quickly. And this was, I think, the largest trade union movement in Europe. So there was kind of a lot of action there, let's say. So the connection of, then back to a point I made on the previous slide, then this kind of connection then of social democracy and the Jews, that the Jew, he believed, was the leader of social democracy, and that the social democratic press as well was predominated by the Jews, and all of these kinds of things. So we kind of got these kinds of statements, allegations, slurs made and repeated multiple times. Yes, I think you can sort of see some of them on the slide there. He talks about the leering grimace of Marxism, and again, its association with the Jews. And we know, of course, that in his later years, he often referred to what he called the Judeo-Bolshevik threat. But this link between the Jews and Marxism is expressed clearly here already in Mein Kampf, the Jewish doctrine of Marxism, he writes. Yeah. And yes, so the other thing about this is this need for Germany to prevail. It needed to destroy Marxism and socialism and those political parties which they did once in power. And so again, this is set down here again. He kind of talked about it as fighting for the work of the Lord, if you can imagine such a thing. So he said, to do this would be to fight for the work of the Lord. And it's kind of another statement of this vision he had of himself as some kind of messianic leader, fulfilling a divine mission to rescue Germany from its enemies. Okay, let's move on. So we've got time to cover everything. To be sure, war and the expansion of German power were absolutely central to Hitler's worldview. He believed in might over right, or power over morality, in his proposed and later actual conduct of foreign policy. the Nazi policy of Lebensraum, or living space, an acquisition of territory to the east, as well as an expansion of empire more generally, central to Hitler's ideology, and of course as central to Nazi policy too, was already espoused here in Mein Kampf. And again, kind of in telling this story of himself, he says, even as a boy, I was no pacifist. When the First World War broke out, he says he was glad that he was born in such a time so he could not fight for Austria, but so he could die for his people, the German Reich. In the aftermath of that war, so at the end of the First World War, Hitler, as I'm sure you know, was filled with fury and disbelief about the events of November 1918. He talked about disgraceful news. They wanted to capitulate. How was such a thing really possible? And again, he kind of started here with a kind of myth that grew through this period. Popular among this period of the stab in the back, that the miserable and degenerate criminals who signed the armistice were kind of betrayed their whole country, I suppose, is what he said, the November criminals. Okay, going forward, Hitler maintained the need to really push forward a particular line of German foreign policy, so to move out of a situation that he did not believe was suitable, because he believed that Germany was restricted in its land and space, and so the desire was for an acquisition of new territory or living space. So he was sort of talking about, in terms of how German foreign policy should be, was to not only take, reconquer lost territories, but also to not only preserve, but take more and more territories so that the nation could expand. And the reason for that he said, so the reason he gave for that was that he said that the German nation could only defend itself as future, as a world power. And to do that, it needed to expand. So all of that about the land and the soil and the blood and the soil and the victorious sword with which he was going to secure land for the German people was about a strengthening of German power by gaining a new soil. And again, particularly, as we know, I've mentioned it already, the land in the east, so what he called Russia and her vassal border states. And again, that's again a fight against the ideology that he despised, Bolshevization, which he twinned with a fight against the Jews as well. So all of that pointed to what came about in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, and the aim to extinguish Soviet Russia. So this ideology, Ostpolitik, or Eastern policy, to acquire the necessary soil that he regarded to be necessary for the German people, was the essence of the Nazi Lebensraum policy as put into action during the course of the Second World War. I think I just said that. Okay. And then finally on the themes, as I said, it's not an exhaustive list of themes, but I just picked some key ones. I wanted to talk a little bit about propaganda and education, partly because, as Joe said, I've just done a book on propaganda and posters, but I've also written about Nazi education too. But just touching on this, because propaganda was something that Hitler understood the importance of, it seems, from a very early point. And he actually, you can see there, sort of said the correct use of propaganda is a true art. And this was all about influencing the masses. It was all about trying to influence each and every last member of the population. So not just to make them lukewarm to the system or anything like that, but to actually make true believers in the system. So the propaganda that he talked about then, things like slogans, symbolism, all of these aspects were very important from this very early date and continued right through the Third Reich. But this was the thing he said. He said the receptivity of the great masses is very limited. So he's kind of sort of saying they won't receive much, they won't understand much. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting, he writes, is enormous. So there's just this, need then that if you're going to get this message across, you've got to do it by all means at your disposal. And this is what they did, from posters through films, through radio, through the press, to name a few. So every different angle, and these kind of slogans that would be repeated and dinned in to make sure that everyone understood what he wanted them to understand. So this kind of persistence was something that he recognized and talked about here very early on. And with education too, I'll just take this point in a condensed way, I think. He again, kind of in the way that he talked about education in Mein Kampf, he was very much critical, as he was of other policies, of the way that Germans were being educated, because he didn't think that they had a devotion to the folk, that they didn't have a sense of their nationhood, and all of those things, and particularly in terms of kind of things like reproduction and he talked about things like beautiful bodies finding one another to give the nation new beauty in the next generation. So there's kind of quite a lot about breeding, and I won't talk about it much now, but I can talk about it later in the questions if anyone has. But essentially, he was already at this stage as well talking about physical training, so kind of onto the curriculum for boys and for girls, and with different outcomes. So this was kind of to make them resilient, to make them understand the importance of the nation and their role in it. And he said that education and training had to be ordered so that those receiving it believed that they were absolutely superior to others. And so again, this question of physical strength and dexterity, invincibility of the people, and creating through education what he called a racially conscious and patriotic national comrade. So then again, this kind of whole thing was education's not doing what it should do. We need children to understand that they should understand about blood purity and things that I've already touched on about racial miscegenation that I talked about before. And in the end, in terms of the goals, for boys, it was to be into the military and to kind of become good, upstanding young German men who would be prepared for military service, who would have their health certificates for marriage, and be able to play their part in the state and in the folk. And for girls, the goal of education was about becoming a mother in the future. So that was already here. All of these ideas on education were already stated here in Mein Kampf. And again, they underpinned the policies put into place once the Nazis came to power in 1933. Okay, I'm going to move on because I want to just spend the next little bit of time talking about the sales and the kind of post-45 period. So let's start by saying that Mein Kampf wasn't an immediate bestseller, maybe no surprises there. The first edition was 10,000 copies, and it did more or less sell out, and there was a second edition. But then after that, the sales kind of dropped. Of course, this changed, and this is why I said earlier, if Hitler hadn't kind of had his trajectory to what he became, it would have remained like that. There'd have been those few thousand copies, and they'd have been relegated maybe to wherever. But when the Nazi Party started to make those big gains in the Reichstag elections, the parliamentary elections, then the sales of Mein Kampf increased accordingly. So we've got figures reaching something like 80,000 by 1932 and more than 1 million copies in 1933, the year that Hitler came to power. So I've seen different figures, but 1 million, 1.5 million. So this is a copy of the 1934 edition. So we've got them at the IHR. They're in the special collection, so they're not there on the open shelves, and they're quite interesting. I had a look at them last week in preparation for this. I thought I'd take a picture, and they said it was okay to show you. They kind of got this kind of cloth-bound cover, the oak leaves, red writing. Inside, there's the picture of Hitler and the table of contents. And as I said, they were a gift as part of a much wider gift from the German government actually to the IHR during the 1930s. So that's like kind of what one of the editions from the 30s looks like. And then this idea about more widely available and more widely accessible, that from 1936, a copy of the People's edition of Mein Kampf, in both volumes bound together, was to be given to all newlyweds on their wedding day. And the point was essentially to try and get most households, I don't think it was every single German household, but most households to kind of have this copy in their on their bookshelf. And businesses would give out the book to employees as a bonus for good performance, and all different versions were made available, like a deluxe edition with gold leaf. There was a Braille edition in 1936, and so on. So during this period of the mid-1930s and kind of up until 1945, this book then became a bestseller. So we're talking about that kind of amount of copies being sold, so more than 10 million and more, with millions sold more abroad, translated into at least 16 languages, a special edition for Hitler's 50th birthday. So we kind of just got this idea about how that grew. Now, of course, how many people actually read Mein Kampf, or how much of it they read, if they read it, we don't know for sure. What we do know is that it made Hitler extremely wealthy, allowing him to purchase this property house Wassenfeld in the Obersalzberg Bavarian Alps, which he later expanded and lavishly decorated to become the Berghof, his mountain fort, where he spent a lot of time. So it made him personally very wealthy and a best-selling author. Okay. Strange as that sounds. Okay, so a little bit now about the aftermath and the sort of relevance today. So at the wartime conferences at Yalta and Potsdam, the Allies agreed policies to denazify and demilitarize Germany and to re-educate the Germans. And in keeping with these policies, Mein Kampf and other Nazi texts were removed from circulation, and their republication was prohibited. And what the American authorities did at the time then was to transfer the copyright of Mein Kampf to the Bavarian government, on the understanding that they should absolutely not let it be reprinted. And indeed, that Bavarian government used its legal power to prevent the reissuing of Hitler's book in Germany and elsewhere. With the exception of English language versions, actually, and I've got one here. This is just the one from my office. This is the edition with the critical introduction, written actually by my former supervisor at the LSE, the late and great Donald Cameron Watt. And I think what he writes, I mean, it's obviously a much shorter critique, but it kind of really is a kind of very important and strong words that I think are in there. And I think the kind of just knowing that he did that, maybe there's just been something in my mind that made me think eventually I should read the whole thing, but you can ask me about that later if you want. Anyway, so then the copyright ran out. So in December 2015, so on the 31st of December 2015, the Institute for Zeitgeschichte, or the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, decided to issue a 2-volume annotated version to expose the lies, the half-truths, the vicious tirades of Hitler and the Nazi regime. So I've got the, as I said, the GHI London kindly just lent us these, so I could just sort of show you what they look like. I think I've got a picture that I took again in the IHR across the way. So that's this critical edition in two volumes, and okay, so you can see that. Do I go backwards? Right. Okay. Of course, several hundreds of thousands of Mein Kampf original copies survived. According to the Institute, can still be found in antique shops and bookshops. But of course, Germany's justice system maintains that any republication or distribution of the original without annotation remains illegal. Magnus Brecken, the deputy director of that institute, the Institute for Zeitgeschichte, said that after the 70 years had passed, since the end of the Second World War, the annotated version detailing new research into the rise of National Socialism adds an important academic framework in order to study this controversial text within a wider context. The original version of Mein Kampf, I mentioned it before, around 600 pages long, where you can see these are quite big volumes, so there's a lot more there. This critical edition has something like an additional 1,300 pages added to Hitler's text, and obviously drops the original artwork. You can see it's kind of very, very plain and grey. Whilst Mein Kampf undoubtedly has an enduring influence on neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic extremist groups and individuals, it's nevertheless a significant historical source, one which we need to use judiciously. But if we use it judiciously, educationally, it shows us the dangers of underestimating the impact of these kinds of ideologies and ideologues. Such a critical edition is useful to clearly refute and reject what Hitler wrote. As Brecken notes, the neo-Nazis and the anti-Semites don't like this critical edition. So I think it can and should be used carefully for educational purposes. And as I was sort of saying to one of my students that I met on the way in, she said, I came here for all the right reasons. I'm giving this lecture for the right reasons too. So just a few points in conclusion. Mein Kampf was the equivalent of a gospel for Hitler's followers, especially those who saw him as he certainly saw himself. I've mentioned this a couple of times, I believe, as this kind of messianic figure with this God-given purpose. Once the Nazis were in power, as we've seen, copies of Mein Kampf were to be found in most, not every single, I don't think, but most German households, kind of in a similar way that a Bible might have been, and there we've kind of got that analogy again. As Plökinger rightly contends, we have to leave the legend behind that it was an unread bestseller. Whilst many may easily dismiss his words as the ramblings of a madman, I mean, you'd be familiar with all of these things, the reality is that Hitler came to power and wrought devastation, destruction, and the largest genocide in the course of modern history. I think, and that's why I kind of agreed to give this lecture tonight, that the centenary of the publication now is an opportune moment to remind ourselves that vigilance is necessary to prevent the rise of extreme political movements and autocratic leaders representing dangerous and indeed murderous ideologies. Extreme nationalist ideas of the type found in Mein Kampf are not uncommon today, so they're not going to be exactly the same, but you can kind of see resonances. And whilst Hitler's personal anti-Semitism, which came to permeate state policy, as I said, once he came to power in 1933 and culminated in the Holocaust during the Second World War, is perhaps the most widely known and discussed ideology expressed in Mein Kampf, Hitler's fundamental aim to destroy democracy shouldn't be forgotten. This was absolutely central too to his thoughts and action, and I haven't talked about that much so far, but I'll sort of say it now, that the anti-democratic sentiment that was expressed in Mein Kampf, that kind of sentiment has many advocates today in political parties and movements across different parts of the globe. Maybe if we can properly understand concepts of citizenship, human rights, civic duties, and those kinds of things, we could protect political freedom and democracy in a meaningful way. We could promote the rebuttal of its enemies wherever they stand on the political spectrum. And the dangers of extreme nationalist ideology also have not disappeared in the contemporary world. Very last page. You'll be relieved to hear, I'm sure. As I said much earlier on, and I'll say it again because it needs to be said, Mein Kampf sets out an abhorrent and pernicious ideology with distasteful, violent, strong, graphic words, but illustrative of a man who actually needed to be taken seriously. So there were those who ridiculed him, those who mistakenly believed that what he said just wouldn't happen, that it was just rhetoric. Hitler was underestimated and the dangers he posed were misunderstood. People thought his words would never be translated into deeds, and this proved to be folly. For many, many years, I taught about the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust to university students. And just share a very small thing about that, about doing that the students were always very surprised, and let me say even shocked, when we analysed excerpts from Mein Kampf. I think it was only when they saw the words, and I think you've seen some of them here in black and white as well, so only when they saw them in black and white on the page did they really begin to understand what they were dealing with when it came to Hitler. Yes, so it was revelatory, and I think it is educative. In contemporary times when anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head again, the hatred is still there, and the toxic language, regrettably and shamefully, seems to be reminiscent of what Hitler penned a century ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for this fascinating and thorough exploration of a very long text. So now you don't have to read it, fortunately. We have time for some questions. Yeah, okay. I can take questions from the room and also from our online audience. If you want to ask a question online, please either type it into the chat and I will read it out, or if you prefer, you can raise your digital hand and we'll come around to you and you can unmute yourself. So I should also say, we're a full crowd. If you could please keep your questions relatively short and questions, that would be much appreciated. And also we'll keep them related to Mein Kampf and its legacy. Thanks. Yes.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Can you say a bit more about how it was that this Austrian from a humble background became so enamored of the German race and culture? And you talked about things he hated, which helped to shape his culture, but not the things he was attracted by. And I wondered if Mein Kampf addresses that. And related to that, was Nietzsche an influence on his policy, or is that just a sort of distortion people have placed on Nietzsche?
I think Nietzsche, among others, have been mentioned, and those kind of idea about a will to power, Übermensch, all of those ideas could be just kind of bits and pieces that Hitler sort of picked up among so many. So he was kind of, I sort of talked about some of the other writers and thinkers that he kind of picked up those ideas from. And Nietzsche was another one. Spengler and the Decline of the West was another one. So there's kind of quite a lot of different influences, and it's kind of almost like a magpie picking bits of them and kind of putting them together into something which I did describe in the end as quite incoherent. So that's the second bit of your question. Just the first bit was, how did he become so?
Well, what were the things, you talk about the things he sort of hated
about
the Jews and the Austrian, which sort of formed his ideology, but what was he was clearly very attracted to the German race and culture, and I wondered, does he address that? Is there a sort of side of that which comes across in Mein Kampf?
I think there is, and perhaps some of the bits I picked out maybe don't were kind of more on the kind of hatred of what was going on in this cosmopolitan Austrian Empire. But again, it kind of goes back to these ideas of pan-Germanism, this idea that all Germans should be part of the same. And as I said, it's kind of got its history in the way that the German Empire was created, who was in, who was out. But certainly he was very much influenced by a number of thinkers and writers who were, as I said, kind of, we describe them as sort of pan-Germans, that they'd argue that everyone who spoke the German language should be together in the same state, and he argued not only that because Jews could speak German but they didn't belong. So to him that was more than that, it was of blood, right? So those of German blood should be within the same state. And there's kind of one of the aspects of Nazi ideology was this aspect of blood and soil, so that those belonging absolutely were part of the, kind of part of a bigger whole and should be together. And that really was a big, of course, had a very big impact on all sorts of policy. I talked a little bit about how that impacted education, that the Germans, as they were growing up, they were kind of, he was sort of arguing that the German nation was languishing because the way that the education system was working wasn't to inculcate the youth with those kinds of ideas. And then by contrast, he said, you need to give them those kinds of ideas so that they will have an understanding of this greatness of Germandom, he called it, and their part in it. So then it kind of then goes hand in hand with those aspects about race and belonging, exclusion, who fitted in, who was excluded, and all of those kinds of things. So I hope that answers.
I'm going to ask a question from Zoom. What was the initial reception of the book, i.e. before the Nazis seized power? Are there any book reviews published during the time 1925 to 33?
Well, I know you know the answer to that, Joe. So yes, there was quite an interesting sort of, I think, mixed reception really in a way. So again, there's on the one hand this tendency to not take him seriously because, who was he? He was this leader of a small party that by this point as well had been banned. So there's kind of the whole history of the origins of and development of the Nazi party from after the First World War until 1923 and the Beautiful Putsch, and then the kind of party falling into demise before he then came out and resurrected it. So yes, there was some of that, but I think because he was sort of in that position then, in a kind of position, actually by writing, he's kind of scrabbling to keep his name up. I think in the period when he came out of prison, the situation in Germany had actually changed quite a little bit as well. So from the period before, where there'd been the hyperinflation and kind of all sorts of economic crises and political and social difficulties. And he thought, the nation's ready for this coup d'etat, this putsch, and turned into a fiasco. But then the party, as I said, was banned, and he's in jail. And now he's kind of thinking, well, how am I actually going to keep my voice and keep the platform, and then also keep my faithful followers? So I think I've got a little bit off, but the point was about addressing that, who he was addressing it to. And, I mean, in a way, sorry, I don't know if that answered the question, because I've got off a little bit.
I think it did.
But following on from that, I was kind of also thinking this morning, I kind of think about kind of when we're looking at historical sources in one way. If I think about years of work that I've done with, say, undergraduate students over the years, and the kind of very basic thing we do as historians is to look at something like that, look at a book in this case, who wrote it, why, look at the historical source and think who wrote it, who did they write it for, when did they write it, we've covered all of that, and why. And I think the function I've described quite a lot. So I hope that was helpful. The other thing I'd say is that a bit earlier in the year, I published a special issue, which Joe, in fact, was one of our contributors, among others. And I think some of the contributors in that actually addressed more. I've touched on it a little about the different aspects of the function, for the party faithful and that kind of thing. But who he was writing it for, I think, is quite important as well.
You're having the first.
Yep. Out of curiosity, what do we know about his emotional journey, especially when he was living in Vienna as a young man, exposed to this, multicultural city, and through your research, have you seen any correlation emerge between his life over there? Maybe he had lots of friends, not so many, maybe he was mixing with different groups, maybe he was just throwing himself into the nightlife. What do we know about it?
I think what we know is that, in terms of his kind of emotional development, so that, I mean, this seems to be kind of quite a popular thing among the TV documentary makers. They kind of always ask us this kind of, so what was his relationship with his mother? What happened when she died? What about his father? We kind of see a lot of, I think, kind of in terms of the, let's say, the development of his character, we kind of think a lot about the way that he was perhaps treated by his father, how his mother, on the other hand,
Doted.
Sorry?
Doted.
Doted.
Yes. Yeah. So the mother, much younger, doted on him, and so that he kind of had this sort of great sense of himself, this kind of almost narcissism that grew out of that. I mean, do we want to go too much into the psychology? And then I suppose right after his mother died, that was when he went to Vienna. And in fact, his father had also died by then. So he had an orphan's pension. So he wasn't as penniless as he pretended. But on the other hand, he was, or not as penniless as he made out, but it wasn't easy for him, I suppose. We can think about, I suppose, if we kind of think about those Vienna years, what we're thinking is this rejection from the Viennese Academy of Arts. So he wanted to be an artist, and then he wanted to be an architect, and none of that was happening. He's sort of selling these postcards that he painted to make a little bit of extra money, and spending most of his time, I think, quite a bit as a loner, and quite a bit, as I said, kind of developing these ideas. I mean, maybe, as we said, sort of forming particularly more between 1919 and 24, but these were already sort of starting in those years that he spent in Vienna. As I said, how accurate that is about how penurious his existence was is questionable. But what he did do was become very influenced. He was kind of reading a lot of these pamphlets in the press, and there he's imbibing all of those kinds of ideas. So particularly on the on the radical right that were very current. So it wasn't that they were unusual, they were actually pretty much quite commonplace as well in that period.
I'm going to ask another one from Zoom. I wonder why the English language edition does not translate the title into English. Do you think this is out of fear of touching it? As in the become, well, I'm not probably supposed to half, but
I'm not sure I understand that.
so
My would be, wouldn't it, Mein Kampf?
yeah. Well, I suppose the first part of the question. Why isn't it translated into English in the English translation?
Good question. I don't know. But I can look it up and get back to that person.
It's a curious one. And someone, and maybe
I've never actually thought of that, but yes, it is a good question.
I think there's another one that could have a short answer as well. There is so much out there about it, including this lecture. Is it worth the time to read it?
Do I recommend reading it? Absolutely. Who in this room has read it? Anyone? Yeah, I know Neil has, and a few of you have actually read it, whole thing, cover to cover. It's impossible. Huh? I wouldn't recommend it, I have to say. I mean, as I said, it's kind of sort of funny, strange in a way. I've teaching about this at university for a very long time, as I said, and kind of did extracts with students over the years. And also, I did, of course, refer to it from, my own research and stuff about education or the family or eugenics and stuff like that, that sort of pertained, the bits that pertained more closely to things I was writing from my PhD onwards. And as I said, my old professor there writing the introduction. So it kind of was always with me. And I kind of always, I don't know why, just throughout all of those years, and I don't know if it's wrong to say it, but I actually did not read the whole thing cover to cover all those years. Once I retired from my lecturing position and kind of just took on a more relaxed role over here in Senate House, I kind of had a different amount of time, and I don't know, somehow I thought the time was right, I suppose. So and I think the time was right as well because this centenary was coming up. So I think why I wanted to finally read it cover to cover, without putting myself through too much pain, which it was, but why I wanted to read it cover to cover was really to, kind of to reflect for myself on what can we think of this after 100 years. And yeah, as I said, it is controversial as it is an important historical document. So I don't know if that even answered the question, what the question was now.
We'll take another one from the room. Oh my word. I think your hand went up, possibly.
Me?
Yes.
Did Heidegger ever comment publicly on Mein Kampf?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. But again, I can look that up if you. I can give you my card and I can drop you an email. But no, I don't know that offhand.
There's another one. Yes.
How was Hitler influenced by events in Italy at the time?
By events in
Italy.
Mussolini.
Yeah.
I think quite a lot. So the relationship between Hitler and Mussolini is actually quite interesting. So that Mussolini was the one who was the originator of fascism, and he set up his party in 1919, and he marched on Rome in 1922, I believe. So I think Hitler was very impressed by that, actually, by the kind of quick growth of that fascist movement, this new movement, this third way that was doing something completely different, moving away from socialism, moving away from liberalism, and kind of offering a very new ideology. And there are obviously a lot of similarities. We don't see anti-Semitism there in the early years of Italian fascism. In terms of personalities and that kind of the seizure of power in in Italy, I think that Hitler was influenced by that and sort of saw that almost as a model or an example. And thought, yeah, maybe Germany was ready the following year, but as we saw, of course, that wasn't the case. And he very much in that kind of earlier period was kind of looking up to this sort of great originator of this new ideology. And then, of course, as the years went on, the relationship changed, and that kind of power dynamic between the two of them changed throughout the course of the 1930s and obviously into the wartime period. So I hope that answers.
Thank you. I'll take one from Zoom. The German working class movement notoriously failed to prevent Hitler's rise to power. Might this failure have affected the rise of subsequent fascist movements and the global eclipse of the left? Well, maybe we'll keep it focused on the Nazi period or the Hitler's rise to power. What role did the failure of the left-wing parties play in allowing that to happen?
Yeah, I think I mean, this kind of split on the political left in Germany, and indeed similarly actually in Italy in the case that we just talked about with Mussolini's rise to power as well, I think was one very important aspect among a number of factors that really helped Hitler to power. It wasn't the only one, but it was a significant one. So we've got the kind of sort of significant split, I think, ideologically between the Social Democrats and the Communists. And the Communists were kind of very much at odds with the Social Democrats, the Socialist Party, saying they weren't kind of almost, they were fascists themselves. They were not in for upholding the workers in the way that the German Communist Party was, although the Socialist Party was much bigger of the two. But nevertheless, those kind of conflicts between the different leaders of those parties and the inability of them to stand together to prevent the rise, although there were, I mean, of course, there were individuals who tried, but it was kind of fighting a bit of a losing battle in a way, because there was so much intimidation from the stormtroopers and from the Nazi Party and all of its kind of different organs already, that it was very difficult. But it is one factor among several that helped Hitler for sure.
Yes.
So was there a predisposition in German society for the suppression of the opposition that was exemplified by the stormtroopers, murder across the Luxembourg and Wiener? There was a fertile ground that allowed this egocentric person a unique opportunity. When the communists were such a strong force in Germany, were there any parties or section of society with an interest at stake who would provide Hitler with the necessary backing when needed?
Yeah, I mean the communists, not that big. The Socialist Party was much bigger. We said they didn't work together, so that's one thing. But on the sort of more on the right, then you've got those figures who were surrounding Hindenburg right at that moment when it was important. So Hindenburg kind of quite looked down and dismissed Hitler. He didn't like him personally, but it kind of got to this point after a number of successive governments between 1930 and 1932, all of them failing to deal with the economic crisis. So this was another big factor, the impact of the Wall Street crash, huge unemployment, all of those things. And then it's this kind of combination of forces on the German sort of right and sort of conservative, on the German sort of right and nationalist that were supporting people, kind of having the ear of the president and eventually kind of helping Hitler to power through that way. So I think that would be the one that was more significant. Does that answer? I hope so.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. My question, kind of two parts, goes back to your reading of the text. Have you read it in both German and English. Did you notice any kind of discrepancies or differences in tone in that sense? And secondly, do you think a reading from cover to cover, you know, adds to the incoherence rather than just dipping into something which, you know, I mean, if you dip into the Bible, it will make sense, doesn't it? You know,
Did you say adds to the incoherence?
Yes, by starting at the beginning and going to the end, rather than, if you dip into something, you know, you're not fully aware of the.
Yeah,
thought process.
yeah.
I don't know.
The whole thing. But again, that would depend on how something was written. So I've read it from cover to cover only in English. I've read bits of it in German. So that's the honest answer to that one. And then coherence. Yeah, I mean, there's the thing, as I said, you kind of put these kind of extracts together, and you could kind of almost have something, if you did that, you kind of string it together. And I've probably kind of made more sense of his ideology than he did in kind of presenting it in a coherent way. And the point of my coherent way was to outline what Nazi ideology was, as he outlined it in Mein Kampf, not to speak for him. But I mean, as I said, I would not. Who would want to read that? Because as a piece of writing, as I said, it's kind of just this combination, and it is incoherent because it's a combination of these big slogans, and they're kind of all the things that we've kind of become very, very familiar with. And then these, but very rancorous, and then these kind of really large tracts of very dull stuff. So it's not very compelling reading, and that argument is not, you couldn't trace the argument in the way that I did. I've just kind of picked a few themes and went through them fairly coherently. That's not the case in there.
So your conclusion is you should have started painting.
Well, the world would be a very different place if he had. What can we say?
There is a kind of related question on Zoom. You mentioned several early translations. Who published them, and for what kind of target audience?
Translations, I understand, were in more than 16 languages, in 16 languages, 18 languages, so kind of quite a lot. And I understand that they were, again, this is, I think, probably explicated much more clearly in the special edition by one of the authors. But it was kind of one of two ways. So it was either those who were kind of into the idea and kind of trying to kind of glorify the ideas in Mein Kampf, or the opposite. So they came from either one response to it or the other, and kind of quite exactly like that, very opposing motives, I would say.
Yeah. I think we'll take a couple more questions. So
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, when you were speaking there about the text and its contents, he didn't have an editor then, they just like published whatever he spouted, is it?
It's quite interesting because he did have Max Amann was the kind of publisher, and I think he did offer him editorial advice. So, I mean, for example, the title that he originally had was much longer. I can't remember it from the top of my head, but 4.5 years of blah, 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 like a really long title. And one of the things that this Max Amann did say to him was, we can't publish a title like that, which probably from a publishing point of view was good advice. We need to make it much more short and succinct. And then he kind of settled on my struggle, on Mein Kampf. I think that, you know, there kind of was some help with writing. I mean, it was initially held that while he was at Landsberg, it was originally held that he actually had dictated it to Rudolf Hess and another one of his acolytes there. But I think the more recent research has suggested that actually he had this typewriter and he was sort of typing it himself. But I know that he had the discussions with Rudolf Hess, particularly on the theme of Lebensraum, which kind of then he kind of developed a bit, and there was this other one of the professors as well that Rudolf Hess had studied with, who kind of had quite an influence as well. I think it was from the university in Munich, and so those ideas he kind of developed a little bit as well, even after that he'd being freed from his time at Landsberg, he was then sort of sitting developing these with Hesse, with Hesse's Hesse's, she was his wife or girlfriend at that point, I can't remember, but his partner, who was again kind of very anti-Semitic, and they were kind of discussing all of these ideas. So I suppose they're not Hitler's alone. And again, as I hope was clear from the lecture, these ideas and these words, they weren't just Hitler's, they were kind of very prevalent, and they kind of grown up around from the end of the century before and into the 20th century to influence him. I'm not sure, again, I've kind of probably gone off the question, but I hope I answered it somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, like you said, it's repetitive, so an editor would have like tightened.
Oh yeah,
And
no,
made
it
it
doesn't seem,
coherent.
I mean, I wouldn't give my editor a book that looked like that. I promise you. So yeah, it's kind of strange. You'd think it is. But again, maybe that's something to do with that kind of description I gave of it at the beginning as this kind of hybrid thing. So think about what was the purpose of why he wrote it. So maybe that thing about showing that he was the single founder of this movement, and again, he had to restamp his authority on the party as leader in the aftermath. So maybe there's kind of quite a lot there in terms of who he was writing it for, who his audience was, and so on. So
One more question, and I think I'm going to give it to Professor Neil Program.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. I mean, I want to come back to this question of readability and legibility too. And I'm picking up on the question earlier. I think when you do read it in the German, what actually comes across is how 19th century Hitler's prose style is. It feels, or it reads to me like actually quite an archaic German. And that might sort of help us to think about how we might find it a bit hard to grapple with, not just because it's a wee bit unstructured and itself, but also because it just uses languages that we're no longer particularly kind of familiar with and forms. But it doesn't mean that people back then couldn't read it. Because they're more steeped in that sort of writing and reading culture. So you were talking earlier about the sort of genre of the autobiography and the political manifesto and history writing in there. But there were also moments in there, and you mentioned one or two, but where Hitler claims to have seen a Jew for the first time, and scales fall from Zion or whatever on the building's side, and the end of the war, where he hears about the armistice while he's kind of blinded in. They're like those kind of turning points in a Bildungsroman.
Yes, exactly. That was the other thing I was thinking about.
And
yes,
although we don't get that kind of literary move anymore because none of us read Bildungsroman because they're also very long and boring. But back then, people are steeped in that kind of reading culture. And so they kind of get it. And so what I'm trying to say, I think, is that that book would have been a whole lot more readable to people back then than we tell ourselves. And when people after the war said that we didn't read it, it was boring. Of course, that's doing an awful lot of political heavy thing. Other people want to claim they didn't know.
No, I mean, again, in the you're absolutely right, Neil. In the special issue, we've kind of got quite a lot about again, kind of said in the lecture, leaving behind the myth that it was an unread bestseller. How not just this thing in the house on the shelf that no one looked at. They might not many might not have read it cover to cover, as some of us in the room have read it cover to cover, but I'm sure a lot of people didn't. I think the other thing as well that's probably quite important to say, although it's a bit off your question, Neil, is that having it was a sign of conformity as well. So it was kind of quite important as a sort of gesture towards the regime during the Hitler years as well, to be seen to actually have it in your house, kind of conforming to the regime. And then again, there's kind of that whole blurred area about, it's there, but we don't really want to read it, but we're going to keep ourselves safe almost in a way by having it there, something like that. So there's kind of quite a lot of kind of quite grey areas as well in terms of people's motivations. And that kind of coming of age story that you said is certainly very interesting. And he, as I said, he kind of does sort of tell it like, in this kind of autobiographical manner, and he's this kind of key figure. It's very, well, it's quite narcissistic in that way, I think. And then that's combined with, but I've got to make sure that everybody who reads it knows what these key bits of ideology are, and make sure that my followers not only know that I'm the great one who thought up all these ideas, but also that I should be back leading the party afterwards as well.
Well, thanks to everyone for your questions, and thank you to Lisa for fielding all of those questions. I'm sorry we don't have more time. Please, if you're in the room, please join us for some drinks and nibbles just down the end of the corridor after this. But first, please join me in thanking again